Welcome to Between the Vines. My name is Kevin Martin. I'm here with Brian Head and my other team member, Andy Musa. We wanted to talk about some regulatory proposals is what we're going to start off with. We also have a few other things to discuss today, and we'll see how far we get. A lot of stuff happening, and whatever we don't get to, we can certainly cover next week. But definitely wanted to touch on what's going on with some of the federal regulations related to pesticides. Andy?
Yeah, we just want growers and processors to be aware that the United States Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, is asking for comments about the re-registration and uses of two fungicides, Xyram and Hyperdione, which is trade name Rovrol and I think Meteor. And these two materials are used by grape growers in both Pennsylvania and New York. And what they're doing is asking for comments, which they regularly do when they're examining or looking at the different pesticides. So before they make a final decision, they like to get comments from the public and the industry. So we want growers to be aware of that. And I think in the crop update, this upcoming one, Kevin, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, that's right. It'll be next Thursday. So today is Friday the 11th. We'll have a crop update on the 17th.
Okay. And in that, they're going to have a blurb that I think Hans Walter Peterson out of the Finger Lakes put together, along with Alice Wise. And I think they talked maybe even to Jen about that. And that'll be in our crop update. So if you do want to make comments or sort of review some of the studies that the EPA did with their concerns of re-registering these materials, you can go to those sites. And it also has, it will also have a link to the site where you can make comments. And in that, it also, you can find where it sort of gives some hints about, how they want the comments made as far as, being productive and don't just say, hey, we want this material because we like it. There has to be some data behind it, but they do like to hear from growers in the industry and the general public. So if you do want to make comments, check out that crop update and then go to those links. So we encourage you to do that. So we'll talk a little bit about, Xyram and Hyperdione, and I'll switch it over to Brian. But, Xyram is a multi-site fungicide, and, there's only a few that we have that are multi-site. And these materials are low risk for resistance management. So I'm going to let Brian, I'm going to switch it over to Brian, he's a pathologist, great pathologist, and he's stationed at the lab in Northeast, the Great Research and Extension Center at Northeast. And I'm going to switch it over since Brian's agreed to join us today so he can talk a little bit about Xyram and Hyperdione. Brian?
Okay, well, yeah, Xyram, of course, very old fungicide. I think it was introduced 60 years ago, around 1960. So it's been around for a long time. Like Andy mentioned, it's a multi-site inhibitor, which makes it sort of resistance proof. Fungi that it controls don't generally develop resistance to multi-site inhibitors. And so it's very useful in that respect. It controls a number of diseases on grapes. We apply it on grapes for black rot control, for phomopsis control, and downy mildew control. And I think, the loss of Xyram would be particularly bad for juice grape growers. Not so much for wine grape growers, because I think we've got other multi-site inhibitors like Captan and Mancozeb that can be used longer in the season. But with juice grapes, at least in in this region, along the Erie Lakeshore, growers are prohibited from using Captan and Mancozeb once bloom begins. And so Xyrem is kind of the go-to material after that for those three diseases I mentioned. And, being a multi-site inhibitor, it's used for resistance management, for controlling things like downy mildew. Not so much for Phomopsis or black rot. We have other materials for that, and those diseases are less likely to, the pathogens causing those diseases are less likely to develop resistance just because of their nature. They don't reproduce as quickly as something like the downy mildew pathogen. But beyond just resistance management, it's probably the only thing we have for Phomopsis control after bloom begins in juice grapes. So that's pretty important. Phomopsis is largely controlled, fortunately, in pre-bloom applications, but there is a need to continue controlling Phomopsis at least through the first or second post-bloom spray, depending on the weather in any given year. And so, if we lose Xyrem, we don't really have anything to control Phomopsis with in that post-bloom time period for Concord, Niagara, Catawba grapes, that sort of thing. We do have the strobilurins, which have been shown to provide some control of Phomopsis. There's not been nearly as much data, I think, developed for Phomopsis control from strobilurins, but they will provide some control. Unfortunately, the strobilurins have kind of faded from use. They're probably not very expensive at this point, but still, and they will control black rot as well, but they've kind of lost their ability to control, I think, powdery and downy mildew. But they could be, possibly a go-to material for post-bloom Phomopsis control if it came to that, if we do lose a material like Xyrem.
But with that, Brian, also, the Xyrem is, like you already mentioned, low resistance, low risk of resistance development, whereas the materials that we would have left at that time, even if they, were more effective, which, like you said, they might not be as Xyrem, their risk is probably high and medium. I mean, the materials that we would have, is that correct? Or
yeah, but I think in the case of Phomopsis, we also have not just we're not just looking at the high risk of resistance in the material itself, but we're also looking at the pathogen. The pathogen is not as likely to develop resistance as, say, something like powdery mildew, because the Phomopsis pathogen generally does not have repeating life cycles throughout the year, throughout a given season, and so is much less likely, I think, to develop resistance. Same thing with like black rot, developing resistance to, say, the sterile inhibitors, which can be a high risk, but we generally only see powdery mildew resistance to sterile inhibitors, not black rot resistance. And there is some evidence too, that now that I mentioned sterile inhibitors, there's some evidence, but not a lot. And I don't have a lot of confidence in the idea that sterile inhibitors might help control Phomopsis as well. But
so when we're talking about that, really, it would be, as far as the pathogen, it would be downy mildew that,
right.
If we lose those multi-site,
that would be the major concern for resistance management. Right. Now, we could resort to.
Yeah, the one thing I would comment on that you mentioned, Brian, is we're seeing the strobilurins sort of fade from use. Probably, I don't know if it's because of other crops. I guess that's the best thing that I could speculate. But we have not seen a precipitous drop in price yet. Certainly nothing that would I guess it's affordable enough so you could use it for Phomopsis if you really had to, but it would be sort of a dramatically different price point compared to what we're used to using in Concords for Phomopsis. So typically, what for Phomopsis we're almost spending nothing. We might be putting on sprays slightly more frequently because you might use a Xyram, so then you might follow up in 10 days instead of 14 because Xyram washes off or something like that. But other than that, you're using materials that do other things. And, if a bound, we know it doesn't work on powdery. If it doesn't work on downy, then you've got a black rot Phomopsis post-bloom material that's running around $15 an acre. So that's dramatically different than a Xyram or an EBDC that's somewhere between $15 and $20 that's covering downy, powdery, downy, Phomopsis and black rot. So
Right.
that's certainly an economic adjustment. But your point is well taken. Is we've seen that abound come down from 25 at a high to 15. So if it continues to decline, other than concerns about resistance, which probably shouldn't be understated, financially, maybe it would be okay someday, but we're not there yet.
Now we do have another multi-site inhibitor, copper, that we could use for downy mildew control. It's kind of fallen out of use, I think, because it's just a little nastier to work with, especially the powders. But it's an old material and it's very effective in downy mildew. Probably not enough, good enough for powdery mildew, at least around bloom, but on Concord, it does a decent job for powdery mildew. So that's another option. As far as the Hyperdione, that's another.
Before we go to that one, Brian, well, finish up on the Xyram, unless you have some more comments about Xyram, do you?
Well, actually, I could mention too that I think, like I said, I think this is a juice grape grower problem if we Xyram rather than a wine grape grower problem. They have Captan and Mancozeb that they can generally use, and Mancozeb is probably overall better than Xyram because it's better on things like downy mildew.
Yeah, and but sort of reiterate some points before we get off this Xyram is that, like you said again, it would be probably most important for the juice grape growers up here in the Lake Erie region because, again, Mancozeb and Captan can only be used up to bloom, and then the only other multi-site for all three of those diseases would be Xyram. Fortunately, we may have, like you mentioned, Brian, copper for downy that growers could go to. But really, when you talk about it, we only have those four multi-site materials: Mancozeb, Captan, Xyram, and copper. And as an industry, we would like to keep as many of those as we can for both resistance management, tank mixing and cost, as Kevin said.
Yeah, and I think. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, it's not like juice grape growers are going to be using this stuff up to, to its PHI, pre-harvest interval. We generally only apply maybe one or two Xyram applications after bloom. And so, you've got a couple months or more of weathering to take place that, removes a lot of that residue too. So that, I think, might reflect well on a decision to maintain it, at least to allow growers to use it a couple, 2-3 sprays at the most after bloom. And then they wouldn't need it anymore for really. Okay.
Well, again, finally, unless there's any other comments, Kevin or Brian, concerning Xyram, I'll just, before we go to Hyperdione, just mention again that, again, EPA, to address the identified risks of concern to both human health and the environment, the agency is proposing again to cancel all registered conventional uses of Xyram. And those comments, if any growers or processors want to make, should be made by April 4th is the deadline. So just be aware of that. And again, it's in the crop update. Will be in the crop update upcoming one, those sites and where you can make those comments. Link will be in that crop update. I think now we can move maybe to the Hyperdione. And again, EPA is proposing that they're going to, I think, limit the, what they're proposing, at least for grape growers, is to reduce the application rate for grapes from 1 pound active ingredient per acre to almost half, 0.6 pounds of active ingredient per acre. And, you know, as we get into this, I'm going to turn it over to you, Brian, as to what, you know, the Hyperdione is used for, and, you know, maybe, you know, what you think of maybe the efficacy, reducing it that much for botrytis, you know, if it would even be effective. So did you want to comment on the Hyperdione and what it's used for in grapes?
Yeah, well, it's another old material, been around for maybe 40 years. 1979, I think, is when it was first introduced or got a federal label. But it's used for botrytis and on grapes. It's used for some other diseases on other crops, but it's a botrytis material on grapes. And there has been resistance developed by the botrytis fungus in many areas to this chemical. It's a FRAC2, I think. And it's sold as Roverol, like you mentioned, Andy, and also Meteor from UPI. But it's important, I think, in that the botrytis fungus develops, you know, resistance to things pretty quickly in a lot of cases. And it has developed resistance in many places to Hyperdione already, since it's been out there for so long. But I believe the research has also shown that the pathogen developing resistance to it, it comes at a cost. And so when you lay off the use of the material, it comes at a fitness cost. When you lay off the use of the material, you might regain some efficacy to that material again. And you can, you know, lay off of it for a few years and then maybe return to using it again, and it'll be effective once again at controlling botrytis in grapes. One application, you know, limiting it to one application might not be too bad. I think we've been kind of mentioning that we probably should only use it once or twice at the very most in any given year. And we've got quite a few FRAC groups that we can choose from for botrytis control. So that's good too. But just losing one, or like you said, having to go down to 60% of what we're normally using to control botrytis may render it pretty ineffective, especially if there's the slightest bit of resistance out there as well. Now, it might be used maybe with a tank mix with another botrytis material, something like that. But, you know, we have a material called Switch, I think, that's got botrytis FRAC groups in it for that reason, you know, for resistance management. And it might be relegated to something like that for its use if that approval down to one application and at 60% of what we used to use. And again, this is just a wine grape problem too. We're not talking about juice grapes being affected really at all. And there are other FRAC groups that growers can resort to, but we just we hate to lose any of them, to lose any of those tools for controlling this disease, because it could be pretty devastating particularly in some varieties, some wine grape varieties.
And my major concern with is not the fact that, like you said, if they limit it to one application per season, because that's, probably what the most one or two that growers would be using now anyway. But my concern would be them cutting it down to, like you said, almost less than half of what we're using now. How effective would that be? And that's my concern. So,
me too.
Yeah. So, again, before we get off the Xyrem and the Hyperdione, check out the crop update if you're interested in making any of those comments. They'll have the sites URLs there in that crop update as to where you can make comments, or if you wanted to read about what EPA has looked at already. I think there's going to be a site where you can go to for both Xyrem and Hyperdione if you wanted to, check that out. And again, if you want to make any comments. But we just wanted to make growers and processors aware of that. EPA is soliciting comments, and you have to, again, by April 4th.
Yeah, and if you, depending on how you get this podcast, if you can see the full description on your phone or your desktop, you'll have a link to the Federal Registrar site where you can make comments if you so desire.
The other thing I before, we get off this podcast, or Kevin, you jump in with some other stuff. I just wanted to mention, again, I'll turn it over to Brian, but if you could make a couple comments about, some of the, probably the major, there hasn't been that many changes in the grape guide, the upcoming 2022 grape guide. It went to the publisher at Cornell, and hopefully, probably by the end of March, I think it will be published, and we'll get it out to growers where it'll be available. But if you just wanted to mention a couple of changes as far as fungicides that will be in the 2022 guide.
Okay, yeah. Of course, we added Sevia, I think a year or two ago, to the guide, which is a new sterile inhibitor for powdery mildew and black rot control. But the entry for that in the guide has been updated because there's a new label out for it now, a 2022 label that lifts the restriction on varieties. It used to be that with the old label, you could only use it on Vitis vinifera. Now the varietal restriction has been lifted, and you can apply it to all varieties, natives and hybrids. It's, well, as we talked about in the guide, it's an excellent black rot material, and it appears to do very well on powdery mildew as well. Better than, I think, most, if not all, of the other sterile inhibitors that are out there now that are older. The other material that's recently been added is gattin. Katie Gold at Cornell has added that to the new guidelines. It's a frac group that we have not used before for powdery mildew control. It only controls powdery mildew, to my knowledge, but it's a good one. So it should be, there's no varietal restrictions that I know of on that. So it should be a good additional tool for powdery mildew control. And if the price is right, check it out, apply it, because it's good to excellent on powdery mildew. I would say, it could be used around bloom at that critical time to control fruit infections, and should do a bang up job.
And Kevin, Brian mentioned the price. I don't want to put you on the spot, but as far as gattin,
yeah. So I hate to talk specifically about price, but this year I'm going to have the caveat of last time I checked, even if I checked yesterday, because occasionally we see things move very quickly in terms of price. But what I would say is there was limited use of Gatton last year, probably in part because it had just come out, wasn't even in the guide. We had 1 out of 4 of our suppliers carrying it. The guys who used it were very happy with it. It's going to come in as probably, if you use the minimum rate and you're comparing the minimum rate to any powdery mildew material in juice grapes, it's going to be your most expensive material, but probably only by $1 or $2 per acre. You start getting into what some of our growers have been doing. They're looking at grape juice prices of $350 to $400 a ton. They have not been happy with powdery mildew control. They're using maximum rates of Quintec. They're using higher rates of Avando. If you start doing things like that, you're probably going to get better results with Gatton, but I'll defer that to Brian. You'll certainly save money. So it's definitely a great option for that post bloom critical period. Sevia is a little bit similar. So technically, I guess Sevia would be the most expensive powdery mildew material a juice grape grower would use. It might be $4 or $5 more than, say, a low rate of Avando, but it does cover other diseases. So in the end, if you take a look at what you're putting in your sprayer, that may actually be something that looks like an affordable option. It's probably not going to save you a lot of money, but it's certainly going to, increase your ground speed when you're spraying because you're mixing up less stuff, and it's going to be an effective job for a similar price or potentially less, depending on what else you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think the price that I from one distributor it's a 4 to 5 ounce rate, and it was like $21 for the low rate, about $26 an acre for the high 5 ounce rate.
Right. Okay. So that's a little bit cheaper than what I had heard. I thought it was closer to 25, but for that low rate, and I can't imagine. Do you think anybody's going to use that high rate yet, Brian?
I don't think it's necessary. We've been testing it for several years, and the 4 to 5 ounce rate, we're not seeing any significant differences in terms of black rot control with it, especially on Concord.
Yeah, and I don't know if it was your work or the work of others, but it looked like they changed the rates on that label as well and sort of narrowed down what you could do, which is probably good news from a cost perspective. We won't have growers using higher rates because the label says they can, even if they don't need to. So
actually, I think they, at least from my experience, there was a 3 ounce rate that we were testing as well, and that's gone now. That's no longer the label. And interestingly, that one, in some cases, we actually did see at the 3 ounce rate a slight depression in powdery mildew control, I think, in comparison to the higher rates, the 4 and 5 ounce rate, but no differences between the 4 and 5 ounce rate. So I think the label's, it's good.
So you can see why they dropped it, I guess, because if you're seeing that when it's brand new, you're just probably encouraging resistance.
It's still, even the 3 ounce rate did a pretty good job. Yeah.
It did. Yeah, $21 an acre, it covers most of your diseases. So again, in that post-bloom period, I would think from a management standpoint, that would be a pretty affordable option. Once our juice grape growers lose EBDCs, wine grape growers, are probably going to be interested in both of these materials as well based on their cost, but they'll be a little more flexible about where they put them on. It might be later in the season or before bloom. But yeah, these are definitely good tools for our juice grape growers to have right now. It's good timing.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to mention, which is interesting with Sevia, that is a sterile inhibitor. And, and that's, like Brian said, working very effectively on powdery mildew. Did you want to comment about that? Because some of those SIs, they've really slipped, and we've had resistance in there with a lot of other SIs. So did you want to sort of comment a little bit about that? Because it's a little weird, I guess, if growers saying, hey, this is an SI and why is it working and these other ones aren't? Did you want to comment a little bit about that?
Yeah, they're all, I mean, it's in the same class as like tebuconazole, which we've been using for many, many years and seems to have slipped in terms of powdery mildew control. But the chemistry is slightly different. It's in the same chemical class, but it's slightly different. And that difference means a difference in efficacy as well. And so we're seeing efficacy similar, at least in our trials, similar to things like difenoconazole, which can't be used on Concord and some red hybrids. And so, Sevia might be a substitute for that, where you can't use difenoconazole. I should mention too that, for wine grapes, especially really expensive wine grapes, I would say that Sevia is certainly going to do a wonderful job on powdery mildew in Concord and certainly on Niagara around bloom for fruit protection. But it's still, our experience is still not as good as the very best materials. Things like a lot of the succinate dehydrogenase inhibitors, the FRAC 7s, things like Aprovia would be, and the fluopyrim in the Luna series fungicides. Those are probably still going to be a little bit more effective. And for wine grapes, especially premium wine grapes, those I think would be the top-notch materials to go to for fruit protection. Sevia is good and sometimes excellent, but those other materials are going to be excellent most of the time. But like I say, if Concord and Niagara growers would like to use Sevia around bloom for fruit protection, I think it'd do a fantastic job.
And maybe the Sevia for the wine grape growers earlier on, since it does such a good job with black rot, using that, earlier rather than around, the immediate pre or post, it
Right.
would, like you said, it would be very good on powdery. It might not be the best, but still be really good. And you get the powdery and the black rot for the wine grape growers if they wanted to use maybe a little earlier or maybe later in the season after they've, had some of those to mix it up so that we don't get the resistance.
Right. Yeah. Good. Maybe like a second post bloom or something like that.
Yeah.
Where you're kind of out of the woods for phomopsis and in some cases at least, and but you still need black rot control and good powdery mildew control, and you'll get it from that.
Okay. The only other one that I did want to mention that is actually out of the guide this year was Topsin M. We took that out. That's no longer allowed to be used in New York and Pennsylvania. And I don't think that'll affect many growers. I really don't have an idea how many growers use it, but it was during the dormant period for canker diseases like Eutypa and Botrytis. I doubt many growers used it, but it was applied as a paint or a directed spray to, when you're pruning. Mainly, I think it was suggested if you're making large pruning cuts.
Yeah.
And I know, I think that New York had a special local needs label for it, but Topsin M is out now and in the guide. And we keep saying the guide just for maybe if anybody's listening from outside the area of New York or Pennsylvania. When we refer to the guide, we're talking about the 2022 New York and Pennsylvania Pest Management Guide for Grapes. I don't have anything else as far as changes as far as the disease program goes. I don't know if you do, Brian. Is there anything else that we want to discuss?
I can't think of anything right now.
Okay. Yeah. Mainly, I think that's what, Kevin wanted us to cover today.
Yeah.
And Kevin, I don't know if you have anything else on prices or anything else that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, we can. I think we sort of knew this was going to happen last week, but sometimes it takes a few days for prices to actually increase, even if they're increasing rapidly. So this we've seen obviously, and we've talked a lot about how prices of certain goods that are very important to growers have been rising over the last 6 to 18 months, depending on what that good is. And we've talked a lot about herbicide issues and really how those prices are all over the place. I've actually seen Roundup in the last 5 days for $50 a gallon, and it's been as high as $100. So it really depends, honestly, on what's in stock and where you can get it, as much as anything, because of the just really bad supply chain issues. But obviously, in the last 10 days, the overarching news story has been kind of the war in Ukraine and that conflict. And in terms of how it directly affects grape growers, the sanctions placed on Russia and the disruption to trade patterns have already started to affect the market. In part, I think, obviously, because these are, this is a global economy where these things are traded. So it's not like we have already run out of supplies of certain things, but it's pretty easy to forecast that there are going to be problems. So the way we deal with that in capitalism is we quickly raise prices. Locally, we've seen urea prices, which have been lagging behind national trends. We've seen them catch up and surpass those national trends in terms of the percent increase. So it looks pretty clear that if you haven't already purchased your urea, that it will very likely be more than $1,000 per ton. That's despite the fact that, especially nationally, there was a bit of a respite in February. There were 10 to 20% declines in price. It came off of those recent highs and fell quite a bit. And nationally, it still has not recovered entirely. We're not setting new records in urea, but I would expect that we will. The other fertilizers are worse. They went up more sharply. I'm not exactly sure why, because urea should be the thing that is most problematic, just based on what Russia does and how we sanction Russia. It could be because some of these price increases were built into the market a little bit earlier than, say, the day the conflict started. So that's could be another 20% above and beyond the already expensive urea prices we were sort of planning on. The other thing that's going to impact is fuel prices. Fuel has been gradually increasing. On-road diesel was, around $3 a year ago, and then by harvest it was closer to $3.50. Now it's $4.50 and well on its way to $5, maybe by the time you listen to this. So we're seeing 30-40% increases there. Most acutely, that's going to continue to affect post prices and potentially other trellis prices as well. We're seeing issues with wire in the supply chain that could get worse because of this. Wire is sort of closing in on $200 a roll for crimped, and is not quite as severe in Pennsylvania, where they tend to use a little less crimped, but still problematic. And then posts, those prices have not changed yet, but we've seen a run up in prices there because that market relies very, very heavily on the trucking industry. And obviously gas prices going from $3 to $3.60 was problematic, as was labor for trucking. Going from $3.60 to $5 is going to be really problematic for posts. So we don't expect that to get any better. It'll get worse before it does. That's the biggest change, honestly, so we've got Roundup and Post. So those are the two biggest changes in the last 3 years in terms of costs. So Roundup, it only took about 6 months for that to go from $8 a gallon to whatever it is now, 50, 80, 100. And then Posts a couple of years ago were right around $6, and now they're going to be probably over 10. They're certainly at 10 right now. So when you add that in terms of how many posts we use and how much Roundup we use, we've got a lot of problems right now with a lot of different inputs, but those are the two that are the worst right now. And, all I keep saying at the end of this is, because I don't want to be too negative, is grape prices are still very high. So we're just dealing with bigger numbers right now. I don't know if this is going to shake out so growers are more or less profitable, but certainly when you're dealing with bigger numbers, risk goes up a little bit because, it's kind of like growing a farm. We don't exactly know how it's going to shake out. So as long as grape prices stay high enough relative to the increase in these input costs, we'll be in good shape. But that remains to be seen, of course. So we're very, very fortunate that grape prices went up first, not these input costs. So we're in a position so at least growers can buy this stuff that they need this year. It happened in the right order, which certainly surprised me because it never does. The only other thing I have, if you listened all the way to the end, you probably don't need this reminder. But if you're listening to us here locally, we do have our Winter Growers Conference. You have missed half of the hybrid event. We've had 6 hours of online content with 3 pesticide credits. If you'd like to, just ask us, and we can give you a copy of that after you register for the full conference. You can get a recording of that. You won't receive any credits, but join us this coming Wednesday, the 16th, if you haven't already registered, and you can see us in person for the first time in a while since last August at a larger event, the first conference we've had in a couple of years. So we'll be back to normal in that sense. We'll be at SUNY Fredonia if you've missed this. But you can go to lergp.cce.cornell.edu and you can register there just like you normally do for our events if you haven't already. So hopefully we see you next week. And if we don't see you next week, hopefully that's because you're not located here locally. You can certainly tune into this podcast and reach out and we'll cover the topics you want to cover. Thanks a lot, Brian. Happy that you could join us and give us an update on this stuff. And thanks, Andy, as always.
Yep. Thanks, Brian, for joining us.